The first night in the cabin was peaceful. The air was cold but fresh, and the silence was almost soothing. I had come here to get away from the noise of the city, to clear my mind and find some peace. The cabin was small but cozy, a perfect hideaway in the middle of a dense forest. The trees around were tall and dark, swaying gently in the breeze. As the evening turned into night, I lit a small fire in the fireplace and settled on the couch with a book. I felt calm for the first time in weeks. Outside, the forest was quiet, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves. I let myself relax, sinking into the warmth of the fire. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed. The bedroom was simple: a bed, a small wooden dresser, and a window that faced the forest. I left the window slightly open to let in the cool night air. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of sleep pulling me under. Then I heard it. A scream. It wasn't distant or faint. It was sharp, loud, and filled with pure terror. My heart leaped in my chest, and I sat up, wide awake. The sound had come from outside, somewhere in the woods. It was unmistakable, a human scream. For a moment I froze, unsure of what to do. My logical mind told me it could be an animal. Some animals can make sounds that resemble human cries. But deep down, I knew this wasn't an animal. It was too raw, too full of fear. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated at the door. What if someone was hurt? What if they needed help? But what if it was something dangerous? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, I opened the door. The cold air hit me immediately, and the forest was darker than I had imagined. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but it wasn't much help. The trees cast long, eerie shadows, and every rustle of leaves made my heart pound. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone out there?" There was no response. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. Even the wind had stopped. I stood there for a long time, listening, waiting. But there was nothing. Slowly, I backed into the cabin and locked the door. I told myself it was just my imagination or a trick of the wind. I didn't really believe it, but I wanted to. As I climbed back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The scream had sounded so close, but now everything was quiet. Too quiet. I finally fell into an uneasy sleep, but it didn't last long. The scream came again. This time, it was louder, more desperate. My eyes flew open, and I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound echoed through the forest, chilling me to my core. I grabbed the flashlight again, but this time, I didn't open the door. Instead, I crept to the window and peered outside. The forest was still. There was no sign of movement, no sign of anyone. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The scream hadn't come from the forest. It had come from inside the cabin. My hands started to shake, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. How was that possible? I was alone. I had locked the door. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. I slowly walked through the cabin, checking every corner, every shadow. The flashlight's beam flickered slightly, and I cursed under my breath. My footsteps sounded too loud in the quiet cabin, each creak of the floorboards making me jump. But there was nothing. The cabin was empty. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream. Maybe I hadn't fully woken up. Maybe the scream was in my head. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I returned to bed, leaving the flashlight on the nightstand and the bedroom light on. Sleep didn't come easily, but exhaustion eventually took over. I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I couldn't place it. It was faint, a low murmuring that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the living room. My heart raced as I reached for the flashlight, the beam shaking as I walked toward the door. The murmuring stopped as soon as I stepped into the living room. The fireplace, which I had left dark, was now lit, a warm orange glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. The window by the couch, the one that faced the forest, showed my reflection. But it wasn't right. My reflection was smiling. I wasn't. I froze, unable to move. The reflection tilted its head, its grin widening. Slowly, it raised a hand and waved at me. My own hand stayed at my side, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then the reflection stepped forward. It wasn't in the window anymore. It was in the room, standing by the couch, smiling at me with eyes that were far too dark. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, and I heard footsteps moving toward me. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the footsteps didn't stop. I grabbed the flashlight and fumbled to turn it back on. When the beam finally lit up the room, there was nothing there. The reflection was gone. The fire in the fireplace had gone out, leaving only cold ashes. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the couch, clutching the flashlight and staring at the window, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When morning finally came, I packed my things and left the cabin without looking back. Even now, I can still hear the scream in my mind. It echoes, sharp and desperate, a sound I'll never forget. But the worst part? Sometimes, when I look into a mirror, I swear I see my reflection smiling back at me. The cabin was perfect, exactly what I needed for a quiet weekend away. Tucked deep in the woods, it was small, rustic, and isolated, with a view of the forest from every window. After weeks of stress, I wanted nothing more than peace, quiet, and a break from people. When I arrived, the cabin felt warm and inviting. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, and the forest seemed alive with the chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I unloaded my bags, placing them on the small kitchen table before taking a look around. The cabin was simple: one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with an old stone fireplace. The wood-paneled walls made the place feel cozy. I could tell it had been here for decades, maybe longer. But there was one thing that stood out: a door in the corner of the living room. It was small, made of thick, dark wood, and locked with an old, rusted padlock. At first, I didn't think much of it. Many old cabins had storage areas or cellars that people locked up. Still, there was something about the door that made me uneasy. The lock looked like it hadn't been touched in years, and the air near it felt colder than the rest of the room. I shook off the feeling, reminding myself that I was here to relax, not to let my imagination run wild. That first night was peaceful. I made myself a simple dinner, lit a fire in the fireplace, and curled up on the couch with a book. The crackling of the fire and the gentle hum of the forest outside were the only sounds, and I found myself beginning to unwind. When it was time for bed, I climbed into the soft, slightly creaky bed and let sleep take over. But around midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you. Then I heard it, a faint knocking sound. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the cabin. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The knocking was soft, almost hesitant, but it was steady. My first thought was that it was some kind of animal. Maybe a raccoon or a squirrel had gotten into the walls. Grabbing my flashlight, I crept out of bed and into the living room. The knocking was louder now, and I realized it was coming from the locked door in the corner. Standing in front of the door, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The knocking stopped. I stared at the door, waiting, but nothing happened. Finally, I convinced myself it must have been the wind or the house settling. I returned to bed, though it took me a long time to fall back asleep. The next day, I avoided the door. I tried to focus on other things, reading, hiking, cooking, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling it gave me. Every time I passed by it, I felt as though I was being watched. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, the knocking started again. This time, it was louder. I turned off the fire and stood in the middle of the room, staring at the door. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The knocking stopped, but then I heard something else, a faint whisper, too soft to make out the words. I backed away, my hands trembling. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone had been trapped in the basement. Maybe they needed help. But that didn't make sense. The lock was rusted shut, and no one could have been down there for years. As I stood there, frozen with indecision, the whispering grew louder, more urgent. It sounded like multiple voices now, overlapping and echoing in the small cabin. Against every instinct, I approached the door. The air grew colder with each step, and my breath came out in white puffs. I placed my hand on the padlock, and the whispering stopped. Then a voice, clear and close, spoke directly into my ear. "Let me out," I screamed, stumbling backward and dropping the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, but I didn't dare move. My heart thundered in my chest as I fumbled to pick up the flashlight. When I finally turned it back on, the cabin was silent again. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I was determined to leave. I packed my bags, but something held me back. As much as I wanted to get away, I felt a strange pull to the cabin, to the door. It was as though something, or someone, was compelling me to stay. By evening, I found myself standing in front of the locked door again, the flashlight in one hand and a hammer in the other. "Just look," I whispered to myself. "Just see what's inside." It took several hard swings to break the padlock. Each strike echoed through the cabin, making me jump. When the lock finally fell away, I hesitated. Slowly, I pulled the door open. A set of wooden stairs led down into darkness. The air that rose from the basement was damp and cold, carrying a faint, sour smell. I shone the flashlight down the stairs. The beam illuminated stone walls and a dirt floor, but nothing else. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, and the chill grew more intense the further I went. When I reached the bottom, I swept the flashlight around the room. It was empty. The walls were lined with shelves, but they were bare. The only thing in the room was a small wooden chair in the center, its legs scratched and worn. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The dirt floor wasn't solid. It had been disturbed, as though someone had been digging. I crouched down, running my hand over the loose soil. It felt soft, freshly turned. My mind raced. What had been buried here? Or worse, what had been dug up? I suddenly felt a presence behind me, cold and oppressive. Spinning around, I saw nothing, but the air felt heavier, thicker. Then I heard it, the voice again, but this time it was coming from all around me. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. That night, I stayed awake, sitting by the fireplace with every light in the cabin on. The whispers started again, louder than ever. They surrounded me, filling the room, growing angrier and more insistent. The cabin felt alive, as though it was closing in on me. Shadows danced on the walls, moving in ways that didn't match the flickering firelight. When the whispers suddenly stopped, the silence was even worse. And then the knocking began again, this time from the front door. Terrified, I grabbed my bags and ran out of the cabin into the dark forest. I didn't stop until I reached my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was dark, its windows empty and lifeless. But just as it disappeared from view, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, watching me leave. I've never gone back to that cabin, but sometimes I dream about it. In the dreams, I'm standing in front of the locked basement door, and the voices are louder than ever. And every time, I wake up to the sound of knocking. When I first saw the cabin, it seemed like the perfect getaway. The listing online described it as cozy and peaceful, surrounded by a dense forest with no neighbors for miles. Exactly what I needed to clear my head. Life in the city had been overwhelming, and I wanted nothing more than a quiet weekend to myself. The cabin was old but charming, with weathered wood and a stone chimney. Inside, it had a warm, rustic feel, worn wooden floors, a small fireplace, and a large window overlooking the trees. It was almost too perfect. After unpacking my bag, I explored the cabin. There wasn't much to see, just a small living room, a kitchenette, and a single bedroom with a creaky bed. Everything felt old, as if it hadn't been updated in decades. But that only added to its charm. On the coffee table, I noticed a photo album. It was old and dusty, the leather cover cracked with age. Curious, I picked it up and sat down on the couch to flip through it. The first few pages were filled with happy family photos. A man, a woman, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. They looked so cheerful, posing in front of the cabin, hiking in the woods, and roasting marshmallows by the fire. But as I kept turning the pages, something changed. The family's smiles looked forced, their eyes hollow. The photos became darker, the backgrounds shadowy and blurred. In one picture, the children were standing by the cabin's window, staring outside with frightened expressions. I closed the album, suddenly uneasy. It was just an old photo album, I told myself. Nothing to be afraid of. But a chill crept over me as I put it back on the coffee table. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bed was uncomfortable, and the forest outside was eerily quiet. I had expected to hear crickets or the rustling of leaves, but there was nothing. Just silence. Around midnight, I thought I heard a sound, soft, like footsteps on the wooden floor. I sat up, heart racing. "Hello." I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer, but the air in the room felt heavier, colder. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was still thinking about those strange photos. I lay back down, pulling the blanket tightly around me. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, but tried to shake it off. I made some coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the forest. The sun was shining, and everything looked calm and peaceful. But when I glanced at the coffee table, I froze. The photo album was open. I was sure I had closed it the night before, but now it lay open to a page I hadn't seen before. The photo showed the family sitting around the fireplace, but something was off. Their faces were blurred, almost smudged, and their eyes were completely black. I shut the album quickly and decided to go for a walk. I needed to clear my head. The forest was quiet and beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, no one was there. When I got back to the cabin, I was relieved to be inside again, but the uneasiness didn't go away. That evening, I decided to look through the album again. I told myself it was just an old book, nothing to be afraid of. Maybe there was some logical explanation for the strange photos. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed something chilling. The photos were changing. The happy family photos were gone. Now, every picture showed the family standing inside the cabin, staring straight at the camera with blank, expressionless faces. In one photo, the father was pointing at the window. I turned the page, my hands trembling. The next photo made me gasp. It was a picture of the living room, the same room I was sitting in. Everything in the photo looked exactly as it did now, except for one detail. In the photo, someone was standing in the corner of the room. A dark figure, too blurry to make out, but clearly there. I slammed the album shut, my heart pounding. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the photos. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the mind, maybe some kind of old photo effect that made them look strange. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time, they were louder, heavier. They were coming from the living room. I sat up, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped, but then I heard another sound, soft, faint, but unmistakable. It was the sound of a child giggling. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the bedroom door. My hands were shaking as I opened it, shining the light into the living room. It was empty, but the photo album was open again, lying on the floor in front of the couch. I approached it slowly, my breath coming in short gasps. The album was open to a new photo. It was a picture of me, standing in the bedroom doorway, holding the flashlight. I dropped the album and ran back to the bedroom, slamming the door shut. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching the flashlight and staring at the door. Every now and then, I thought I heard whispers, but I told myself it was just the wind. When morning finally came, I decided to leave. I couldn't stay in the cabin another night. But when I stepped into the living room, I froze. The photo album was gone. I looked everywhere, but it had completely disappeared. The coffee table was empty, and there was no sign of it anywhere in the cabin. I packed my things as quickly as I could and headed for the door. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it, the sound of a camera shutter. Turning slowly, I saw the photo album sitting on the couch. It was open to a new page, and I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The photo showed the cabin, but it was empty. There was no furniture, no signs of life. Just an empty, dark room. I grabbed my bags and ran out of the cabin, not stopping until I was in my car and driving away. Even now, I can't explain what happened in that cabin. I try to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home. Sometimes late at night, I hear the sound of a camera clicking, and when I look in the mirror, I swear I see someone standing behind me, smiling. It all started when my best friend, Mark, found the cabin online. He was always finding strange places for us to explore, but this one seemed different. The pictures showed a rundown wooden cabin, deep in the forest, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out the sun. "It's perfect for the weekend," Mark said with his usual excitement. "No cell service, no distractions, just us and the great outdoors." I wasn't so sure. The cabin looked eerie, even in the daylight photos, but Mark's enthusiasm was hard to resist. So I agreed, and a few days later, we packed up our gear and drove deep into the woods. When we arrived, the cabin looked worse than it had in the pictures. The wood was rotting in places, and the windows were so grimy you could barely see through them. The air smelled damp, and the forest around the cabin was deathly quiet. "Rustic charm," Mark said with a grin, pushing the door open. The inside wasn't much better. The furniture was old and covered in dust. The wooden floor creaked with every step, and the walls were lined with dark, faded wallpaper that seemed to ripple in the dim light. But what caught my attention was the shadows. Even with the sunlight streaming through the windows, the shadows in the cabin seemed darker than they should have been. They clung to the corners of the room, shifting slightly when you weren't looking directly at them. "Creepy," I muttered under my breath. "What?" Mark asked, dumping his bag on the couch. "Nothing," I said quickly. "Just, it's quiet out here." That first night, Mark and I sat around the small fireplace, eating canned food and telling stories. The forest outside was pitch black, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. As the night wore on, Mark started talking about the cabin's history. "They say it's been abandoned for decades," he said, his voice low. "No one knows who built it or why they left. But people claim they've seen strange things here, shadows moving on their own, strange noises, that sort of thing." I rolled my eyes. "You're just trying to freak me out." Mark laughed. "Maybe. Or maybe it's true." I didn't say anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, almost alive. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I still found it hard to relax. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Mark. He had a habit of wandering around at night when he couldn't sleep. But as I listened, I realized the footsteps didn't sound normal. They were slow, deliberate, and heavier than Mark's. "Mark," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting for him to respond, but there was only silence. Grabbing my flashlight, I climbed out of bed and crept into the living room. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed to shift as I moved the light around. "Mark," I called out again. I found him asleep on the couch, snoring softly. The footsteps hadn't been his. Suddenly, the floorboards behind me creaked. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the corner of the room. The shadows there seemed darker, deeper, as if they were reaching out toward me. My heart pounded as I backed away, bumping into the couch. Mark stirred, groaning softly. "What's going on?" he muttered, sitting up. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Hear what?" "Footsteps." Mark frowned, rubbing his eyes. "You're just spooking yourself. Go back to bed." I didn't argue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The next day, Mark decided to go hiking. I stayed behind, still uneasy after the night before. The cabin felt strange during the day, quiet and still, but not in a peaceful way. I spent the morning cleaning up and trying to distract myself. But no matter where I went in the cabin, I felt like I wasn't alone. At one point, I noticed something odd. The shadows on the walls didn't match the light coming in from the windows. They were angled wrong, stretching in directions they shouldn't have been. I stared at them, trying to make sense of it, when one of the shadows moved. It wasn't subtle, it slid across the wall, independent of the light. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. "Mark," I called out, even though I knew he wasn't back yet. The shadow froze, then slowly crept into the corner of the room, merging with the other shadows. I grabbed my jacket and ran outside, desperate to escape the suffocating feeling of the cabin. Mark returned in the afternoon, cheerful and completely oblivious to my growing fear. I told him what I'd seen, but he just laughed. "You've been watching too many horror movies," he said. "I'm serious," I insisted. "There's something wrong with this place." "All right," he said, holding up his hands. "If it'll make you feel better, we'll leave tomorrow." That night, I felt a little calmer, knowing we'd be leaving soon. But as the hours passed, the shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. But then I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were louder, heavier, and they didn't stop. They moved through the cabin, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was searching for something. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the bedroom door, my heart pounding. The living room was empty, but the shadows were everywhere. They writhed and shifted, growing larger, spreading across the walls and floor. "Mark," I shouted, running to the couch. But he wasn't there. Panic set in as I searched the cabin, but he was nowhere to be found. The shadows seemed to close in around me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, trapping me inside. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows began to take shape, twisting into figures with hollow eyes and outstretched hands. I screamed, backing into a corner as the shadows closed in. When I woke up, the cabin was silent. The shadows were gone, and the front door was wide open. Mark was standing outside, staring into the forest. "Mark," I called out, my voice weak. He turned to look at me, but his eyes were empty, his face expressionless. Without saying a word, he walked into the woods and disappeared among the trees. I didn't follow him. Instead, I grabbed my things and ran to the car, driving away as fast as I could. I don't know what happened in that cabin, but I still have nightmares about it. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I see shadows moving in the corners of my room. And when I call out for Mark, I swear I hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. My girlfriend, Claire, and I had booked a secluded cabin deep in the mountains for a romantic weekend away. Life had been stressful lately, and the idea of being surrounded by nature with no distractions seemed like exactly what we needed. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding, the road cutting through dense forests that seemed untouched by time. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The cabin was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace and large windows that overlooked the forest. It felt like a place out of a storybook, isolated, peaceful, and perfect. "I love it," Claire said, spinning around in the living room. "It's like something out of a dream." I smiled, glad she was happy. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, like we were being watched. I told myself it was just the eerie quiet of the forest. That first night, everything seemed fine. We cooked dinner together, laughed, and talked about anything and everything. The fireplace crackled warmly, filling the cabin with a soft glow. But as the night went on, the atmosphere began to change. It started with little things, a creak in the floorboards, the faint sound of something tapping against the window. At first, I ignored it, but the sounds became harder to dismiss. "Do you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. The tapping had turned into a faint scratching, like nails dragging against wood. "It's probably just a tree branch," I said, trying to sound calm. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. No branches, no animals. Just darkness. We decided to go to bed early, hoping the unsettling noises were just part of staying in an old cabin. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, the sound of footsteps, or a creak in the hallway. Claire shifted beside me. "Did you lock the front door?" she asked. "I did," I said, but her question made me uneasy. I got up to check, just to be sure. The door was locked, but as I turned to go back to the bedroom, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving across the living room. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, but the shadow disappeared into the corner of the room, where the light from the fireplace didn't reach. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I told Claire about what I had seen. She looked worried, but tried to reassure me. "Maybe it was just the firelight playing tricks on you," she said. "Maybe," I replied, though I didn't believe it. We spent the day hiking, trying to enjoy the beauty of the forest. But even in the sunlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees seemed to press in around us, their branches like outstretched arms. At one point, Claire stopped suddenly, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened, but all I could hear was the rustling of leaves. "It sounded like someone calling my name," she said. I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "It's probably just the wind." But Claire didn't look convinced. When we returned to the cabin, the uneasy feeling had only grown stronger. The air inside felt heavy, almost oppressive, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should have been. We decided to play a board game to distract ourselves. For a while it worked. We laughed and joked, and the strange feelings began to fade. But then, the lights flickered. At first, it was just a brief dimming, but then they went out completely, leaving us in darkness. "Great," Claire said, pulling out her phone to use as a flashlight. "Do you think it's the power?" "Probably," I said, though I wasn't so sure. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and went to check the breaker box. As I opened it, I noticed something strange. The switches hadn't been tripped. Everything was in place. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just the empty kitchen. When I returned to the living room, Claire was sitting on the couch, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked. She pointed to the window. "I saw something," she whispered. It was standing right there, watching me. I looked outside, but there was nothing but trees and darkness. "It's okay," I said, trying to comfort her. Maybe it was just a deer or something, but I could tell she didn't believe me. That night was worse than the first. The strange noises didn't stop, scratching, tapping, and faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls. At one point, I woke up to find Claire sitting up in bed, staring at the door. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. I listened and heard it too, a faint shuffling sound, like someone walking barefoot across the wooden floor. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the bedroom door. The living room was empty, but the front door was wide open. "Did you leave the door open?" I asked Claire. "No," she said, her voice shaking. I closed and locked the door, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. The next morning, we decided to leave. The trip wasn't worth it anymore, and neither of us felt safe. As we packed our bags, I noticed something strange on the wall. There were scratches, long, deep gouges in the wood, like claw marks. "Did you see these before?" I asked Claire. She shook her head, her face pale. We didn't say much as we loaded the car and started the drive back down the mountain. But even as we left the cabin behind, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. A week later, Claire called me in the middle of the night, her voice trembling. I think it followed us," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I see shadows in my apartment," she whispered, "and I hear noises at night. It's like it's still with me." I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, but the truth was, I had experienced the same thing. Even now, I see shadows moving in the corners of my room, and I hear faint whispers when I'm alone. Whatever was in that cabin didn't stay there. It came home with us, and no matter where we go, we can't escape it. There was a trail in Pennsylvania that I walked many times over the years, winding through thick woods, past rocky streams, up and down rolling hills. Part of the trail crossed through private land, where an old, weathered cabin stood among the trees. The owner was never around, or so I thought. The first time I saw him was on a late summer afternoon. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the trees. As I stepped into the clearing near the cabin, I noticed a man sitting on the porch. He was big, with a thick beard and rough-looking clothes. Empty beer cans surrounded him. He looked at me with dull, glassy eyes. "Keep it moving," he said. His voice was deep, gruff. "Ain't no food here." I hadn't asked for food. I hadn't said anything at all. His words felt strange, almost like a warning. I nodded, kept my head down, and hurried past, feeling the weight of his gaze on my back long after I left the clearing. A year passed before I returned. This time, I wasn't alone. My sister, my wife, and her friend were with me. We planned a weekend hike, camping along the trail. I had told them about the cabin, about the man I saw, but they laughed it off. "Just a grumpy old guy," my sister said. "Probably didn't want hikers near his place." The first day of hiking was peaceful. We walked through the towering trees, listening to birds calling high above. Sunlight filtered through the branches, making patterns on the ground. We stopped to eat lunch by a small creek, dipping our feet in the cold water. By late afternoon, we reached the stretch of trail that passed through the cabin's yard. This time, the man was there again. He was standing over a grill, smoke curling into the air. A pile of empty beer cans sat near his feet. When he saw us, his face split into a wide, yellow-toothed grin. "Well, well," he said. His eyes flicked over the women in our group. "Y'all out here for the night?" I hesitated, then nodded. "We're camping a little ways up the trail." "You ought to stay here," he said, motioning to the cabin. "Got plenty of space. And I got food on the grill." My wife shook her head politely. "Thank you, but we already have a spot in mind." His smile faded just a little. "Ain't no trouble. I don't mind guests." Something about his voice made my skin crawl. He was insisting too much. His eyes lingered on my wife and her friend in a way that made me uncomfortable. "We should get going," I said, stepping forward slightly, positioning myself between him and the group. His face twitched. "Suit yourself," he muttered, turning back to the grill. We walked quickly away, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't say anything until we were well out of earshot. "That guy creeps me out," I said. "You think he would have tried something?" my sister asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I don't want to find out." We reached our campsite just before dusk. It was a quiet clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a small fire pit in the center. We set up our tents, gathered wood for a fire, and cooked a simple meal. The tension from earlier began to fade as we laughed and talked, watching the flames dance in the darkness. Night settled over the woods. The air grew colder. An owl hooted in the distance. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the trees. Then I heard it, a faint rustling. I held up a hand, signaling for silence. The others stopped talking. The rustling came again, somewhere beyond the trees. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer. Maybe a raccoon. Then came the sound of a footstep. Not an animal. A person. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness. The firelight didn't reach far, but I thought I saw movement. A shadow shifting between the trees. I stood up. "Who's there?" I called. Silence. Then, a soft chuckle. Low. Muffled. My stomach twisted. I knew that laugh. The man from the cabin. My wife grabbed my arm. "We should go," she whispered. I nodded. We hurried to put out the fire, packing what little we could in the dark. We didn't bother with the tents. We just needed to get out of there. Then came another sound. A shuffling, closer this time. A muttered voice. I caught a few words. "See what they got." Just a look. Panic surged through me. I fumbled in my pack, searching for something, anything. My hand closed around the air horn I always carried. I took a deep breath and pressed the button. The sound was deafening, echoing through the trees, splitting the night apart. A startled yelp. The crunch of leaves as someone stumbled backward. Then silence. We didn't wait. We ran. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs ached. We ran down the trail, through the dark woods, not stopping until we saw the distant glow of a road. Only then did we pause, gasping for breath. The man never followed. Or if he did, we never saw him. The next day, we returned with park rangers. Our campsite was empty, but footprints circled where our tents had been. Beer cans littered the ground. The rangers knew the man. They said he was a local who lived alone in the woods. "He's mostly harmless," one of them said. I wasn't so sure. We never went back to that trail again. There is something about winter in the woods that feels different from any other time of year. The silence is deeper, the cold sharper, and the world feels empty, like you are the only person left on Earth. I had always loved that feeling. That's why one winter, my friends and I decided to rent a remote cabin deep in the woods for a weekend. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, just a few days away from the world, away from work, stress, and everything else. The cabin was old but solid. It sat in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees. A thick layer of snow covered the ground, and more was falling from the sky in soft, quiet flakes. There was no cell service, no electricity except for a small generator, and no neighbors for miles. It was perfect. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend James, and a couple we knew, Sarah and Mark. We had packed enough food and supplies to last for the weekend, planning to spend our time playing cards, drinking, and enjoying the quiet. The first night was calm. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and talked late into the night. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, making the walls of the cabin creak. But inside, it was warm and safe. We had no idea what was waiting for us. The next morning, we woke up to a blizzard. The snow was falling heavily now, thick and fast, covering everything in sight. The wind had picked up, howling like an angry animal. Mark checked his phone, frowning. "No signal," he said. "Guess we're stuck here for now." "We planned to stay anyway," Sarah said with a shrug. "What's the big deal?" James nodded. "Yeah, we have enough food. It's just snow." At first, it was fun. We spent the day playing games, making jokes, and watching the storm through the windows. It felt like we were in a little world of our own, cut off from everything else. But then, as the day turned to night, things started to feel different. The storm got worse. The wind slammed against the cabin, shaking the walls. The snow piled up so high outside that we could barely see out the windows. And then the power went out. The generator died suddenly, leaving us in complete darkness. "Great," Mark muttered. "Now what?" James lit a few candles, their small flames flickering in the cold air. We have flashlights, he said. And the fireplace. We'll be fine. But something about the darkness felt wrong. It pressed in around us, thick and heavy, as if the cabin was sinking into it. And then, in the middle of the night, we heard the first sound. It was faint at first. A soft crunching noise, like footsteps in the snow. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I held my breath, listening. Maybe it was just the wind, or an animal. Then I heard it again. Closer this time. Crunch. Crunch. Someone, or something, was outside. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, pointing it toward the window. The glass was frosted over, but I could just barely make out the shape of a person standing at the edge of the trees. A woman. She was barefoot, wearing only a thin nightgown, her dark hair wild and tangled. She wasn't moving, just standing there in the snow, staring at the cabin. A chill ran down my spine. I scrambled out of bed and shook James awake. "James," I whispered. "There's someone outside." He groaned, sitting up. "What?" I pointed at the window. "Look." James grabbed his own flashlight and shone it outside. But when we looked again, she was gone. My stomach twisted. "You saw her, right?" James nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "But where did she go?" We woke up Sarah and Mark and told them what we saw. Mark frowned. "Are you sure? Maybe it was just a shadow." "I know what I saw," I said firmly. "She was there." Sarah bit her lip. "But why would a woman be out here in a blizzard? She'd freeze to death." No one had an answer for that. We didn't sleep much after that. Every little noise made us jump. The storm outside raged on, the wind screaming like a wounded animal. By morning, the snow had stopped, and the world outside was eerily quiet. We decided to go outside and look for tracks, just to prove to ourselves that we weren't imagining things. We stepped out into the cold, our boots sinking into the deep snow. And then we saw them. Footprints, leading from the trees to the cabin, but not away. "Where did she go?" Sarah whispered. "There's no trail leading back." We followed the prints, our breath fogging in the cold air. The tracks led us toward the edge of the woods, where a large snowdrift had formed against the trees. That's when we saw the clothes. A thin nightgown, half buried in the snow, and a little farther ahead a hand, frozen and pale, sticking up from the snow like it was reaching for something. Sarah screamed. Mark pulled her away as James and I stepped closer, our stomachs turning. It was the woman. She had no shoes, no coat, nothing to protect her from the cold. Her skin was blue, her dark eyes frozen open in terror. She had been dead for hours. My mind raced. How had she gotten here? Who was she? And if she was dead, then what had we seen last night? We hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind us. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, James broke the silence. "We need to call the police." "There's no signal," Mark said. "We'd have to hike back to the main road. In this snow." Sarah shook her head. "It's too deep. We'd never make it." We had no choice but to wait. As the day dragged on, an uneasy feeling settled over us. The woman's frozen face haunted my thoughts. She had been scared. Whatever happened to her, she had been running from something. That night, we took turns keeping watch. No one wanted to sleep. And then, just past midnight, we heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, crunching footsteps in the snow. I gripped my flashlight tightly, heart pounding. "It's not possible," I whispered. Sarah whimpered. "She's dead. We saw her." But the footsteps kept coming. Closer, closer. And then a soft knock on the door. Tap, tap, tap. We all froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Then came the voice. Faint, whispering. "Let me in." My blood turned to ice. I didn't move. I didn't speak. The whisper came again, right outside the door. "Please, I'm cold." Sarah sobbed into her hands. Mark gripped the fire poker like a weapon. I wanted to open the door, to prove to myself that nothing was there. But I couldn't. I was too afraid. We stayed like that all night, too scared to move. By morning, the sound was gone. When we finally opened the door, there were no footprints in the snow signs that anyone had been there. We left that day, hiking through the deep snow until we reached the main road. We called the police, told them about the body. They found her later that day. A missing woman. She had wandered away from another cabin during the storm, lost and confused, and froze to death in the cold. But I know what I saw, and I still don't understand how she knocked on our door after she was already dead. Winter in the woods always felt different from anywhere else. It was quieter, heavier. The weight of the snow on the trees, the absence of birdsong, the way the wind cut through everything, it made the world feel smaller, emptier. I had spent years hiking through forests in every season, but winter always unsettled me the most. That's probably why I hesitated when my friend offered me his family's remote cabin for a weekend. He had inherited it from his grandfather, an old, isolated place deep in the mountains of Montana. The kind of place with no neighbors, no cell signal, no power aside from a small generator. The kind of place you went to disappear for a while. I had needed that. Life had been wearing me down. Work, stress, the endless noise of the city. The thought of being alone for a weekend, completely off the grid, sounded perfect. I packed my truck with supplies, food, water, firewood, extra blankets, my rifle in case of wildlife, and set off early in the morning before the next snowstorm rolled in. The drive was long, winding through narrow, unmaintained roads. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the snow thickened, the trees pressing in from both sides. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. I followed the narrow path until I spotted the cabin through the trees. It was exactly as I expected, small, simple, made of dark, weathered wood. Snow covered the roof in thick piles, icicles hanging from the eaves. The windows were dark, the porch half buried in snowdrifts. The place looked untouched, as if it had been waiting for me. I parked beside the cabin, the tires of my truck crunching through the frozen ground. The silence was immediate. Even the wind had died down, leaving only the muffled sound of my own breath in the cold air. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside, my boots heavy on the old wooden floor. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of dust and aged timber. I turned on the generator, the low hum breaking the silence. A single overhead bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows across the room. It was a simple space. A small kitchen with a rusted stove. A stone fireplace, stacked with neatly cut firewood. A single bed with an old wool blanket. A rocking chair by the window. It felt frozen in time, like no one had set foot inside for years. I set up my things, started a fire, and made coffee. Outside, the sun was already beginning to dip behind the trees, the shadows stretching long and thin. I stood at the window, sipping from my mug, watching the snow swirl through the trees. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the tree line. A girl, dressed in white, her figure barely visible against the snow. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. I set my mug down slowly, my heartbeat picking up. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The way the wind moved through the trees, the shifting light of the setting sun, it could have been anything. But then she took a step forward. Her feet were bare. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. She was too far away for me to see her face clearly, but something about her posture, the way she stood, made my stomach tighten. She was too still, too quiet. I turned away from the window, rubbing my arms. It had to be a mistake. Maybe someone from another cabin nearby, though I knew there weren't any for miles. Maybe she was lost. I looked back. She was gone. I stared for a long time, my pulse still hammering. It was probably nothing. That's what I told myself. The wind picked up again after dark. It howled through the trees, making the cabin creak in protest. The fire crackled in the fireplace, sending flickering light across the wooden walls. I sat at the small table, eating a simple meal, canned soup, crackers, hot tea. Outside, the snow was still falling. The wind blew it into strange patterns, swirling shapes that danced in the moonlight. I tried not to think about the girl. But as the night deepened, an unease settled in my stomach. I found myself glancing toward the window more often than I wanted to, checking the shadows outside, the dark gaps between the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I still locked the door. I banked the fire, crawled into bed, and pulled the blankets up tight. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around me, comforting in the dark. I closed my eyes, and then I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps outside. I stopped breathing. The wind still howled, rattling the windows. But underneath it, I could hear something else. The unmistakable crunch of snow, slow and deliberate. I lay still, my body rigid. The footsteps moved closer. My throat tightened. I forced myself to sit up, every nerve in my body screaming. The sound stopped. Silence. The wind outside surged again, drowning out everything else. I listened, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. I lay back down, but I didn't sleep. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was white and still, untouched. The air was cold, crisp in my lungs as I stepped onto the porch. The snow had drifted high against the trees, erasing most of the tracks from the night before. Most. Not all. I saw them near the edge of the clearing. Footprints. Small. Barefoot. Leading from the trees toward the cabin, but none leading away. I felt my stomach drop. The girl. I followed the tracks slowly, my breath clouding in the morning air. The prints were shallow, delicate. They stopped just a few feet from the cabin, right outside my window. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. No prints leading back. No sign of where she had gone. Just the cold, empty snow. I turned back toward the cabin, forcing myself to stay calm. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. I had two choices: leave, or stay and figure out what was happening. I chose to stay. The day passed in a slow, uneasy haze. I tried to distract myself, chopping wood, reading by the fire, drinking cup after cup of coffee. But my thoughts kept circling back to the tracks. To the girl. Who was she? Where had she come from? How had she disappeared without leaving a trail? I watched the woods as the sun began to set, the light fading into deep blue shadows. The air grew colder, pressing against the walls of the cabin. I forced myself to eat dinner, though I barely tasted it. Night fell, and then the knocking started. Soft, slow, just outside the door. I froze, my fork clattering against the plate. The fire crackled behind me, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. I turned my head toward the door. The knocking came again. Tap, tap. I stood, my pulse hammering in my throat. The wind groaned outside, rattling the wooden walls. But beneath it, I could hear something else. A faint, whispering breath. Right outside the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The fire snapped loudly, sending a burst of sparks up the chimney. And then, silence. I stayed there for what felt like hours, staring at the door. Then slowly, I stepped forward and unlatched it. I pulled it open. Snow swirled in the doorway. But there was nothing there. Just the endless, empty woods. And the single set of footprints leading up to my door. I left the next morning. I didn't pack. Didn't clean up. Just grabbed my keys, started the truck, and drove without looking back. I never told my friend what happened. But weeks later, I looked up the area, searching through old news archives. And I found something. 30 years ago. A missing girl. Lost in a snowstorm near the cabin. Her body was never found. Only her footprints in the snow. I don't know why I agreed to this trip. Maybe I just wanted to be alone for a while. Maybe I thought a weekend away from the noise of the city would clear my head. Maybe I was just tired of everything. The drive up had been long. 3 hours of winding roads, trees stretching endlessly on either side. The cabin was isolated, exactly as advertised. No neighbors, no streetlights, just a dirt path leading to a small clearing. The trees were so dense that even during the day, the place felt dim. I parked my car, stepping out into the crisp air. The sky was pale gray, the kind that signaled snow might come soon. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. A simple wooden structure with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were small, making it look darker inside than it probably was. I grabbed my bag from the car, locking it behind me out of habit, even though I doubted anyone else was around for miles. Inside, the air was stale. It smelled like wood and dust. The furniture was basic, just a couch, a small table, a chair, and a fireplace with a neat stack of logs beside it. The kitchen was small, with an old gas stove and a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The fridge was empty, just as I expected, so I put away the groceries I had brought. The bedroom was just as simple. A bed with a thick, scratchy-looking blanket, a nightstand, and a dresser. There was a single window, showing nothing but trees. I dropped my bag on the bed and took a deep breath. The quiet was overwhelming. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I tried to settle in. I lit the fireplace, made myself something to eat, and sat in the chair, staring at the flames. The heat felt good. Outside, the wind was picking up, making the trees sway. I checked my phone. No service, just like I expected. I had brought some books, but I wasn't in the mood to read. Instead, I just sat there, listening to the fire crackle. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the fire had burned low, just glowing embers. The room was cold. I stood up, stretching, my muscles stiff. The cabin was silent. Too silent. I didn't hear the wind anymore. I didn't hear anything at all. I walked to the window. The trees were still. The sky was dark, no stars, no moon. Just blackness pressing in from all sides. I had that strange feeling, the kind that creeps up on you when you wake up in the middle of the night and feel like something isn't right. I turned away, rubbing my arms for warmth. I added more wood to the fire, watching as the flames caught, flickering higher. The warmth returned, but the feeling didn't go away. I tried to shake it off. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and drank it slowly. My ears strained for any sound. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I shifted my weight. Then I heard it, a soft sound, from outside. It was distant, barely noticeable at first. A rustling, like something moving through the leaves. My body went still. I held my breath. It could have been an animal. Probably was. Deer were common in these parts. Maybe a raccoon. But something about the sound made my skin prickle. I stepped closer to the window. The darkness outside felt thicker, like it was pushing against the glass. I couldn't see anything. No movement. No shapes. Just black. Then it happened again. A rustling. Closer this time. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. I forced myself to turn away from the window, walking back to the fireplace. I sat down, staring at the flames, trying to ignore the way my stomach felt tight. But then there was a thump. A single, heavy thump against the side of the cabin. I shot up from my seat. My heart was pounding. I waited. Listened. Nothing. Just when I started convincing myself I imagined it, there was another one. Thump. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate. Too steady. I moved slowly to the window again. My breath felt too loud. I squinted into the darkness. Nothing. Then movement. Just barely. A shift in the shadows. A shape. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was someone out there, standing just beyond the tree line. Watching. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen. Then they moved. Not towards the cabin. Not away. Just shifting, barely visible. I stepped away from the window, my hands shaking. I reached for my phone, knowing already there was no service. Thump. I almost dropped it. The sound was right against the wall now. Whoever they were, they weren't leaving. I ran through my options. My car was outside, but I would have to go out there to get to it. I didn't know how many of them there were. I grabbed the fire poker, gripping it tightly. It wasn't much, but it was something. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I didn't move. I stood near the fireplace, the poker in my hand, my heart hammering in my chest. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees. And then, just like that, the thumping stopped. I waited. Listened. Nothing. I forced myself to move, inching toward the window. My fingers trembled as I pulled the curtain back, just a little. The figure was gone. The trees stood silent. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until the sun started to rise, my eyes never leaving the window. When it was light enough, I grabbed my bag, my keys, and bolted for my car. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until the cabin was nothing but a bad memory in my rearview mirror. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back. I should have picked a different place. Maybe a hotel. Maybe a cabin closer to town. Something with neighbors, streetlights, maybe even a front desk where someone would notice if we didn't come back. But I wanted privacy. I wanted something quiet, peaceful. Just me and Lisa, away from work, away from our phones, away from the constant distractions of life. A weekend in the woods sounded perfect. The cabin was an Airbnb, cheap, isolated, a little old but well-reviewed. The pictures looked nice. A cozy log cabin with a fireplace, a big wooden deck, a fire pit outside. The kind of place you see in movies where couples drink wine and cuddle under blankets. It was deep in the woods, about 45 minutes from the nearest town. I figured it would be a perfect getaway. The drive up was long, twisting roads that seemed to get narrower the further we went. Tall trees lined both sides, blocking out most of the sky. The last stretch wasn't even paved, just a dirt road with tire tracks, cutting through thick woods. When we pulled up, I felt a little uneasy. The place looked exactly like the pictures, but something about seeing it in person made it feel smaller. The trees pressed in close, the windows dark. The silence was heavy, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound you make. Lisa was excited. She loved the idea of being away from everything. We unpacked, settled in. The inside was nice, wooden walls, a fireplace, a small but well-stocked kitchen. There was even an old radio on a shelf, the kind with dials instead of buttons. The bedroom was small but cozy, a big bed with thick blankets. The first night was good. We made dinner, had some wine, sat by the fire. It felt nice, peaceful. The air outside was crisp, cold enough that the fire felt extra warm. We left the windows cracked just a little, letting in fresh air. I remember lying in bed, listening to the faint rustling of leaves outside, feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. Then around 2 a.m., I woke up. It took me a second to figure out why. The fire was still glowing faintly, casting soft orange light across the room. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. The wind had stopped. The leaves weren't rustling anymore. Then I heard it. A sound from outside. It wasn't loud. Just a soft crunch, like a footstep on dead leaves. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake Lisa. My heart was pounding a little, but I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. Or a raccoon. But then I heard it again. Closer this time. A deliberate step. I swung my legs over the bed, moving carefully. The floor creaked under my weight. I stepped to the window, peering out. Darkness. Just trees. Shadows stretching between them. I stayed there for a while, listening. The sound didn't come again. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe the wind had started again, moving the leaves in a way that sounded like footsteps. Eventually, I went back to bed. It took a while to fall asleep, but I convinced myself it was nothing. The next morning, I stepped outside to get some firewood. That's when I saw them. Footprints, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. They weren't ours. They were fresh, deep. Not animal tracks, boots. Someone had walked up to the cabin in the middle of the night, and then turned back. I stood there, staring at them. The prints stopped about 10 feet from the cabin, then went back the way they came. Whoever it was hadn't knocked, hadn't tried the door. Just walked up, stood there, and left. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I didn't wake Lisa. I didn't want to scare her. Instead, I grabbed a piece of firewood and walked around the cabin, checking for anything else. No broken windows. No signs of forced entry. Just those footprints. Maybe it was a hiker. Someone lost, seeing the cabin, and deciding not to bother us. Maybe it was the owner checking in on the place. I told myself that, but I didn't really believe it. Still, I didn't say anything. We had breakfast, went for a short walk, spent the day lounging around. The thoughts stayed in the back of my mind, but nothing else happened. That night, I made sure the doors were locked. The wind had picked up again, making the trees creak. Lisa fell asleep quickly, but I couldn't. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every small noise. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. A footstep. Then another. Slow. Careful. I sat up, heart hammering. The fire was still burning low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I turned my head toward the window, and I saw him. A man, standing just beyond the tree line. Not moving, not hiding, just standing there, watching. My body went cold. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, his face just barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew he was looking at me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed. Then slowly he stepped back and disappeared into the trees. I sat there for a long time, gripping the blankets, my mind racing. Who the hell was he? What did he want? I didn't wake Lisa. I didn't want to scare her. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I went outside. The footprints were there again. Closer this time. I woke Lisa, told her we were leaving. I didn't explain why, just said I didn't feel comfortable staying. She was confused, a little annoyed, but she didn't argue. We packed quickly. I kept looking at the tree line, expecting to see him again. As we drove away, I felt a weight lift off my chest. The further we got from the cabin, the better I felt. I never told Lisa what I saw. I didn't want her to have that image in her head. But I know what I saw. And I know, without a doubt, that he wasn't just some lost hiker. He was waiting, watching. And if we had stayed another night, I don't think he would have just stood there.